So thanks for coming. This was put together in very short order, so it might not be super elegant, but hopefully you'll get like a good perspective for some of the things we're doing in the lab. I'd like to begin by just thanking a lot of people. I have a lot of folks that I collaborate with. I have a really, really wonderful lab full of folks who help a tremendous amount. Some of them are here. I also want to thank a couple of people in the Dallas community that have allowed me to do research with their students and kids. And of course, the most important thing is obviously the actual children and the families and the teachers who participate in our research. So without them, we would have no data. So there. Yeah, so I think I've gotten really, really lucky. Not just for all the support I get here at UTD, but being able to connect with people in the community that have facilitated my ability to collect data. It's been really nice. Okay, so support. This stuff Sarah mentioned already. There might be a couple of pending areas of support. I really can't say anything until I know for sure, but hopefully that would be nice. It'll be nice for Spania and Lindsay, I think, too, because they'll have to teach less. Unless they want to keep teaching. Okay, so when I was trying to put this talk together, I was like, man, like, how do I do this? So I figured, okay, maybe I'll sort of go through kind of, I guess, what I see the overview of our research in the lab, and start out with the areas that I've done the most work in, and proceed to the areas that I've done the least work in. I figured at least that made sense to me. Hopefully it will make sense to you guys. So the area that I've definitely done the most work in, or the more mature part of our research program, is looking at essentially this dynamic dual language development that kids go through. And now that we're working with younger kids than I was used to working with in my research, there's a distinction between when kids get designated as English learners and when they don't. And so when they're really, really young, they might not be designated that early as English learners. So that's why you see dual language learners here, and English learners, because they're qualitatively a little bit different. So the idea is to get an idea of their actual dual language development across time. Instead of doing this cross-sectionally, doing actual longitudinal work allows us to look at actual dynamic development. Looking at more than just 2 time points especially is helpful in trying to determine what are some of these trajectories of change that these kids go through. And importantly also, thinking of looking at that dual language growth before, essentially before kindergarten, right? And then what happens obviously during the school years. The other part of it, which is kind of really built into the same framework, is essentially language sampling analysis, which I guess everybody knows I do a lot of that. But it's kind of this ongoing, it's an ongoing sort of effort to look at what are some ways that we can use language sampling that we may not have used before as a clinical research tool, both maybe measuring components of assessment, to even measuring things like progress monitoring, intervention, things like this. The other piece that I've done the least amount of work in, but I think is really interesting, is trying to look at online measures of processing, and eye tracking is one way to potentially do that. Okay, so next couple of slides, some of you may have seen some of this stuff, but I promise I'll move into new stuff later, but I do want to sort of establish the context of the work. So the overall sort of approach of looking at language, the way that I look at language is I look at it as a dynamic system. So looking at it from dynamic systems theory. And dynamic systems is something that a lot of you probably know about. It kind of sort of began with gait analysis, and then it became analysis of bacterial growth and viral growth and so on and so forth, and now a lot of disciplines use this. And the idea is that if we look at language as a dynamic system itself, we can see how it obviously dynamically develops over time. And we can look at subsystems of language as the components of language that can potentially co-impact one another as kids are acquiring language and then they begin to acquire a second language over time. So we'll talk about a couple of these subsystems today, some measures of morphosyntax and vocabulary, verbal fluency, and grammaticality, which is being increasingly studied in the bilingual child language literature. So this will be a recurring theme as well. And one of the challenges that we have with bilingual kids, I think with all kids, but especially bilingual kids, is they are so heterogeneous. And not only from each other, but they're very heterogeneous in their development over time. So think about it as heterogeneity, not only between subjects, but also within the subject, he or herself across time. So these are just two empirical growth plots for two different kids in the same measure. And as you can see, these two kids are very, very different. They're starting out at very different time points. They have very different functional forms of growth in this particular measure of English, number of different words. And they are ending at very different points as well. Right? So that's just two totally different kids on the same measure. And depending, if you only looked at one time point, you might make decisions about these kids, right? Like if you only looked at this kid at time 1, you would say, well, this kid's better than this kid, right? Doing better. But if you looked at their final time point, you would say, oh, this kid's doing so much better, potentially. So that's the challenge, right? And the challenge gets more complex when you want to analyze lots of kids. What happened? Anyway. So the challenge is more complex when you analyze lots of kids. So this is NEW English. This is several hundred trajectories of the ones you just saw for several hundred kids. And then the same for several hundred kids in Spanish. So a lot of these kids are actually the same kids. And we'll talk about sort of this language sampling piece, which a lot of you know about, but I'll tell you about it anyway. So to establish the context, the idea is I'm going to sort of split this into areas that I'm calling language growth of English learners, and then I'm going to talk about language growth of preschoolers who are bilingual, right? And so, I'm not teaching class, so I probably shouldn't be asking questions, but who can tell me what an English learner is? I just have to ask, because I need to know who knows and who doesn't know.
Don't know.
Don't
I would
know?
just make an educated guess.
Yeah, yes, but
Yeah, make a guess.
what are the
Make a guess.
criteria?
Bilingual. That sounds more smart than what I
So
was
what is the
saying.
question? What is it English? Is it like us?
Yes.
And how is it different from English language?
Oh, that's a really good question. Okay, so
That's what you asked.
so the U.S. Department of Education uses different terminology for kids who come into the school system that speak a language that's not English, and a particular school district, state, they determine that specific kids do not know enough English to be successful in an English-only classroom. Right? So, English learner is a designation provided by the federal government for kids. There can be bilingual kids who are not English learners. So you could have a bilingual kid who's going to go into, let's say, kindergarten, gets tested for language proficiency, and there's all kinds of ways to do this. A lot of the ways that people measure this is actually really poorly done, but they do it anyway. You can have a bilingual kid that scores really well in English, right? So these language tests are usually done primarily in English. And so the kid might score a 5 on a scale of 0 to 5, and it's like, this kid is not an English learner. And you can have another bilingual kid who comes in and scores a 1. And then that kid's below the threshold, let's say, of 3. So then that kid is an English learner, but they're both bilingual kids. But English learners are the kids who are coming in, and essentially they're being labeled and they're being tracked by the federal government, right? And this is really important for school districts because school districts apply for Title IX funding, and they get lots of money for this. So a school district like Dallas, for example, they are very interested in tracking the growth of English learners, I'm sure, because they have a huge proportion of their kids that fall in that category. And so they need a lot of support, a lot of money to develop programs to help the kids acquire English faster and be more academically successful and so on. So anyway, when I talk about what I'm calling school-age kids, essentially from kindergarten on, I'm going to talk about them as English learners, because all the data that I've worked on with these kids are actually kids that have been officially designated as English learners in public schools. So, setting up that little context. So, this is some of the work I had done earlier on, which I've talked about a lot in a lot of different places. This was several thousand kids doing growth curve modeling, which allows us to do really neat things with longitudinal data. It allows you to look at predictors of growth that are different in terms of their behavior over time. You can look at things that remain constant over time. You can look at covariates that change themselves over time. You can obviously look at these sort of like trajectories or functional forms of growth and growth rates. And one of the really neat things is you're able to actually get a lot of information from your variance. A lot of us sort of look at variance as sort of measurement error. This is nice because you can partition variance on multiple levels. And components of that variance actually give you information. Right? So like something like the intercept slope covariance can, depending on what it is, if it's positive and significant or negative and significant, it actually gives you an idea of the strength and the direction between the relationship between where a kid starts out at and how quickly they will grow, or how slowly they will grow. So that's kind of nice. So in this project, there was a couple of primary research questions. One is just looking at, okay, what does the dual language growth look like in kids from kindergarten to 2nd grade? And does kind of their onset of growth or their initial status, right? So when you start tracking their language skills, do these have a significant impact on their growth rates in each of the languages, and if so, in what direction? Right? Is it going to be a positive effect, a negative effect, or is there not going to be no relationship? Right? And finally, does bilingual language growth vary as a function of program type? And we'll talk more about this in a little bit. And are there unique subtypes of growth within this really, really large heterogeneous population, which you probably would expect to find? So methodology, this was secondary data that I worked on. Sometimes I still work on this. It was part of a large project. And this was the final data set that I've worked on. As you can tell, it's several thousand kids. It's a very rich data set. It's longitudinal. There's multiple waves of data collection. Essentially, it's 3 years with 2 collection points per year, fall and spring. And this was the mean age of the kids when they entered the study. So I'll show you some data today on these 3 measures. Mean length of utterance in words. Sometimes people want to know why words and why not morphemes, and that's because English and Spanish are very different languages. Spanish is a highly inflected language relative to English, which is very sparsely inflected language relative to Spanish. So calculating morphemes in a language like Spanish or like Turkish or like Italian is like nearly impossible. So MLU morphemes is not a very useful measure. And in general, across languages, whether you're doing English and something else, typically mean length of utterance in words is looked at as kind of your gold standard you can use for bilingual research. Sometimes people also want to know, well, in MLUM and Brown's morphemes, it's only useful up to like stage 4, blah, blah, blah. Mean length of utterance in words continues to actually give you pretty useful information about these kids' language development. And you'll see what it looks like. Number of different words. That's actually a count of unique uninflected lexemes that kids are using. And if they inflect them, the uninflected root of that word is counted as a different word rather than number of total words. And then words per minute is just an overall integration of language production. So that's just verbal fluency. How quickly or how slowly are the kids talking, including their pausing, between utterance pausing or within utterance pausing, so on and so forth. Independent variables. When you're doing any type of growth curve modeling, you always need to determine what your metric of time is going to be. That's actually going to be one of your covariates. That's your most basic covariate. In this case, we're going to use academic semester, and looking at these 2 other covariates of growth. And so this is the piece that I've shown a lot, right? These are these three measures in Spanish. Blue are boys, red are girls. And down here are the semesters. So this is the fall of kinder, spring of kinder, so on and so forth until the spring of second grade. And so, sometimes I show this to people and I ask them kind of what they see. People will say, well, the trajectories look very similar between boys and girls. In some measures, for example, like NEW Spanish, you can tell that there's a pretty large separation between the girls and the boys, but overall, they're pretty similar, right? Now, if we look at the growth trajectories of the same kids, but in a different language, we see pretty drastically different trajectories, right? So here you actually see negative growth, right? So the kids actually regress during the summer. But as far as NDW is concerned and words per minute, there are some slight discontinuities in the growth trajectories, but overall they're pretty aggressively linear. Okay? And so what that means is whenever you have a linear trajectory, that means, for example, let's take this as an example. This growth rate and that growth rate and that growth rate, they're identical. That's what that means when it's linear. Right? When you have something that's curvilinear like these are actually cubic functions. That means that you have periods of acceleration, and then whenever it changes direction, that's called curvature in growth curve terminology, and then you can have periods of deceleration. Right? And so the growth rates between time points are going to be very different versus linear ones. So then you have, essentially what you have here is you have the same kids doing the same task in two different languages, and they're performing very differently in their languages. Right? And of course, one of the questions is like, why is that happening, right? There's two different languages. All these kids are acquiring English as a second language. One of the other things that you can probably see too is, even though these kids look kind of similar, the girls and the boys, for a lot of these, there's actually a significant difference between genders. But when you look at their English, they're largely overlapping. Right? So there's all kinds of information in kind of like these little figures, and there's a lot of data that you can actually look at. The other piece is, is there an impact of initial status on growth? Right? So this is part of that variance partitioning that I was talking about. So for Spanish, for MLUW is the only measure that showed any type of evidence of having some type of significant sort of effect between initial growth and late growth. And what it is, it's a positive and significant intercept slope covariance. So what that means, it's like the rich getting richer, right? So this is kind of like a hypothetical figure. So we might have some kids that start out with a high level of MLUW in kinder. That means that on average, the kids who start out low are not going to grow as fast as these kids. And so then this gap actually gets bigger over time. So if you think about it in terms of what you should more or less predict for the average kid, is that these kids will always have a higher MLUW than these kids. Right? For NDW and words per minute, there's no systematic relationship. So regardless of where they start on their NDW in Spanish or the words per minute in Spanish, doesn't really seem to give much information in terms of what you might expect in the future from these kids. And then this is the English of the same kids. And for English, the relationships actually apply to all the measures that we talked about, that I just talked about. And that's a negative and significant relationship. But that's the inverse. So that means that if you start out at a lower level of, let's say, NDW or words per minute, the likelihood is that you actually will catch up because your growth rate will be faster over time than the kids that start out higher. So the idea is that over time, these kids will probably catch up to their peers. And so those differences, that gap becomes less wide over time. Okay, this is stuff that you haven't seen because I really haven't shown it to anybody. This is the next sort of phase of this, which is looking at the kids that you just saw, those like 1,700 kids. Those are kids that are distributed across different programs of language instruction. Right? So English learners, when you become an English learner, when the school district says your kid's an English learner, most school districts will have one or they might have a multitude of programs geared towards English learners. And they're getting money from probably their state government, from Title IX funding, to provide these programs, right? And so, three of the most sort of commonly found programs, and these two are actually the ones that you will most commonly find across the country, are these two. Transitional bilingual education and structured English immersion. Dual language, I think, is becoming more and more popular. It's very hard to implement, but it's becoming more popular. So these program types, to me, the titles are kind of self-explanatory, right? But maybe not to you. I don't know. Maybe it is. So what do you think this is? What's the focus of that program?
Does it start with more Spanish, transition into more English?
Yeah, and so there's different variants of this, right? There's like early transitional, late transitional. So the idea is that, in theory, if you implement this program the way that it's designed to be implemented, is that in an early transitional bilingual, typically that means by or on third grade, whatever Spanish instruction is being provided is gradually extinguished. So by the time the kids get to third grade, it's all English. Some late transitional bilingual programs, that's around like 5th grade. And structured English immersion is basically English immersion with support for Spanish. But the interesting thing of it, well, it's not really the reverse. But there's a sort of like who knows what the sort of kink in this is in terms of how it's structured.
Don't know.
So it's structured in, the structure in structured is kind of comical. What it is the kids themselves are able, or there should be someone in that classroom where if I'm a kid in a classroom, I should be able to ask for clarification from an aide who speaks my language. In some implementations of this program, the kids have to ask for clarification twice before they get help. Right? So the idea here is from the very beginning, it might be preschool, it might be kindergarten, the kids are taught entirely in English. So there's no real transition. But the structure part means that there's someone there that should be able to clarify things for the kid, as long as the kid is actively requesting this. Right? So that's the structure part. And then dual language is dual language. It's providing instruction in both languages. There's different ways to implement this. There's different configurations to do this. Some programs, they do this like, they'll do it 1 week, all English. They'll do another week, all Mandarin, or whatever the language is. Sometimes it's 1 day, sometimes half a day. There's one-way dual language programs, and then there's two-way dual language programs. One-way dual language programs are where you're bringing in a bunch of kids who don't know language B, and you're going to teach them this, but they're going to get half of their instructional content in both languages, right? A two-way dual language program is interesting. Also, I think it's also hard to implement in the sense that the idea here is that you want to get 50% of the composition of the classroom, of each and every classroom in the school, to be of, let's say, language speakers of language A. And then you want the other 50% to be language speakers of language B. And all of those kids don't know the other language, but they gradually will learn each other's languages as they go through their academic careers at the school. So there's different types of programs. So the idea here is, how does the language growth of kids differ? Does it differ, right, by programs of language instruction? And are there subtypes or different classes of bilingual language growth within these program types? So in order to do this, you have to do a little bit of a different technique. It's called growth mixture modeling. And what growth mixture modeling is, you're essentially doing growth curve modeling, but the mixture piece of it is you're actually comparing so the models that I showed you a couple of slides ago, those were essentially single trajectory models, right? With growth mixture modeling, what you're doing is you're actually testing models with more than one class, or multi-class models. And you're testing them against a single class model to see if those models help you to capture more of the variance in the kids or not. So the way that we ran this was by looking at covariates on different parts of growth. So intercept, the beginning part of growth, slope, which is the actual growth rate, and the actual different types of trajectories. So we use gender and program type. girls are the reference category for gender, and structured English immersion is the reference category for program type. This sample came from different school districts in different parts of the US. So one of the concerns that we kind of had going in was, are there going to be differences by geographical region, right? So what we did is we actually sort of looked at this pretty actively, and we said, okay, we're going to look at study region, we're going to look at school district and the schools themselves, and we're essentially going to control for those things by making these fixed effects on both the intercept and the growth rates.
So if they're all different schools, are they learning the same languages in all the schools, or is it mixed?
No, so there's different program types. And so one of the things that, one of the covariates is the actual program type, right? And so some schools have only one program type. Right? Some schools in the data set have two program types. So that's why it's kind of important to try to control for as much of the sort of contextual stuff, I guess I would call it, right? So, so that you make sure the differences that you're finding are not due to the fact that kids are going to very different types of schools with different programs, right?
So Spanish English, or is it
This is all Spanish English. I'm sorry, yeah, this is all Spanish English. That's a good question. And so then to specify the models, there's all sorts of things that you do. For single class models, you use this Bayesian information criterion, you get a low number. That's the most strict criterion for single class models. And for multi-class models, there's a couple of things that you do. You want high entropy, and you want this high, they call it AVPPA, this average posterior probability of assignment. And then you actually do a likelihood ratio test, where you're actually taking a multi-class model and you're subtracting classes from it to see if that's a better fit or not, right? So you're constantly testing them against each other. And the outcome measures that I'll talk about today are MOUW and NW. This is sort of a representation of one of the growth mixture models that we estimated, because we did multiple models, but this is one model. Here you see the intercept and the slope. This is just to make it simple, this is like a linear model. These could be the actual classes that you're going to be testing for, and these are the covariates. So these are going to be things such as gender and program type. Right? And then these are the collection points. So kinder fall, kinder spring, so on and so forth, until you get to the second grade in spring. I think what's important is to kind of pay attention in the sense that these covariates are allowed to influence both the intercept and the slope and the actual however many classes you're testing for. Right? So we'll look at MOUW in English and in Spanish. I don't know how clear this will be, but they're actually very different models for the same measure for the same kids, different languages, right? So this probably looks a lot like what I just showed you, right? And it's kind of nice and it's kind of not nice. So it's nice because that means the initial models I estimated actually fit really well when we looked across program types. It's not nice if you were expecting to find lots of different subtypes of growth, right? So at least for MOU Spanish, that's not the case. It's a one class or a single class cubic model. It's a random intercept and slope. That means that across all of those thousands of kids, we're letting their intercepts and slopes vary according to their own variance, rather than fixing them to a particular value. And we're allowing all of the covariates to impact the intercept, not the slope. So these kinds of decisions are made based on if a model converges, right? You can run stuff all day long, but if it doesn't converge, it's not a good model. You don't want to use it. It's basically garbage, right? So we tried every iteration we can think of. So it's like over 70 models. So what you have here is essentially a distinction between boys and girls in immersion classrooms and transitional classrooms. The reason why dual language isn't on here was because there was very little difference between transitional and dual language for this particular measure. So the kids in transitional models start out at a higher level, and they remain at a higher level in this particular measure of Spanish, right? Now, does that make sense? relative to the kids in English immersion? Yeah, right, because the kids in English immersion are in all likelihood receiving very little support for their Spanish, right? So the kids in transitional bilingual, at least, for example, from kinder to second grade, and the kids in dual language are getting lots of support for the native language relative to the kids in immersion. So that makes sense. That's what you would expect to find. Even though some of these differences visually don't look fantastically great, there is a degree of difference. So the growth for the kids in transitional versus the kids in immersion is about 0.3 standard deviations. And then we take the same measure, but we look at English MOUW. And for this particular measure, again, it's the same kids, different measure, same measure, different language. This is actually a 2-class cubic model. And whenever you have different classes, you end up having a different proportion of kids that fall within those classes, right? So this linear model has the least amount of kids in it. So these are kids that start out really low, but they obviously end up catching up, right? This is kind of nice because you do have more than one class. It's also kind of nice because it aligns with what I have found for MOUW English in my prior work, right? This is the relationship that you expect to find. The vast majority of kids are in the second class of model, and that means this is across all the program types, right? And so this is basically girls and boys are red and green, and that has most of the kids. The girls are starting out actually significantly higher than the boys are, even though it doesn't really seem like it. They are. And whenever you do have these classes, then you can also calculate what's the likelihood, what's the probability that a kid in a particular type of program type will be in one of these classes, right? And so there's a much higher probability for an English learner to be in a transitional bilingual program to be here than to be here, right? It's higher than the probability, for example, of a kid in English immersion. Questions?
What does that mean?
What that means is, so because you're not in this particular type of model, you're having unique classes sort of emerge. It basically applies across all program types. In other words, the program type difference here wasn't really significant. It wasn't really explaining much. But you have, it's about 89% of your sample is here, and about 11% of the sample is here, right? What that means is there is about, it's a little bit less, I'm just going to say 25%. It's about 20%. So if a kid is in transitional bilingual, whether the kid's male or female, he or she has a 25% greater probability of being here or looking like this than looking like this.
Okay.
And if a kid is in English immersion, they have a much lower probability of being in this model. So most of them are probably here.
So you don't want to throw kids into an immersion program. Does that mean that?
Well, so this is one of the things about this work, right? Like my goal with doing this is not to try to prove that one program is better than another program. That's not, I don't want to get into all of that because that's a very controversial sort of area. That's not what I want to do. I just want to let the data tell you what it tells you, right? So if we thought about implications, let's say for MOUW, I mean, the implication here is that it's developing in both sets of kids. It will develop faster if you're in a transitional bilingual education program or a dual language program. That makes sense. Right? And for MOUW in English, it means it's going to develop no matter what program you're in. It just depends, like, what's your end goal? Like, is it for the kids to learn English or for the kids to be bilingual? Right? So that's kind of the, if you want to think about a practical implication, it's like, well, what's important to you for your kid, right? And this is NEW Spanish. So for both NEW Spanish and NEW English, they're both one-class models. So again, there's actually not a tremendous number of like these subgroup. I was actually expecting to find like 2 or 3. It's really not happening. So again, that's nice and not nice because my initial estimations actually hold across multiple program types. But I guess you could argue it's not as cool, right? I don't know. But it is what it is, right? So the models are slightly different. They're both one-class cubic models. The Spanish one has random intercepts. The English one has random intercepts and slopes. So for these kids, the slope was fixed for the kids. And then there's covariance on intercept and slope for both models. So here, again, it's probably what you expect to happen. For NDW in Spanish, the kids who are in transitional bilingual programs and then dual language programs, they're starting out higher and they remain faster, right? Their growth remains faster than that of kids in structured English immersion. That also makes sense. And there's a little bit of a switch in the sense that the initial level of kids in dual language program for NDW Spanish is higher, but then the kids in TB actually grow faster. So they sort of kind of flip roles. And then this is kind of cool too, because what you have here, this is your reference. These are the kids in immersion. And then these kids are in transitional bilingual, boys and girls. They start out a lot lower, but they grow a lot faster. And again, this is exactly what I have found in my previous work. So this is actually kind of cool to see. So yeah, I mean, if you wanted to kind of use this stuff and say, I'm going to be a proponent of whatever, the data kind of seems to show, I guess, across these kind of like 1,000, 1,700 kids, it really seems to show that transitional bilingual and dual language arguably gives you more bang for your buck in the sense that you're able to continue to develop both languages versus not developing the other one.
So I'm wondering about the start point. So is the
Yeah.
start like before they go into the program, or is it at some point after you start the program?
The start is in the fall of kindergarten. And so all of these kids began to be sampled approximately 6 weeks into the semester. Yeah.
So would you think that the program would be making a difference at that point, at the start point?
Yeah, so the idea to allow for a little bit of time is hopefully for the kids to sort of begin to be exposed to the program. That's something that could be looked at because all of these kids were not sampled on the same day, right? There's like thousands of kids. So you actually could look at these, but the differences in terms of time are going to be small, but you could look
Yeah, I
to
was just
see,
curious
yeah.
how much you would think the program would have impact at that first wave.
Yeah, so you could look. I mean, what this also sort of tells you, and also in the previous stuff, is that parents are self-selecting their kids to be in specific programs. The parents that can, right? Some parents don't have a choice. Some parents, you go into a school district, you live in a neighborhood, you're going to go to like wherever your kid can go. Some parents might have the option to potentially send their kid to like a charter school. Some kids may really want their kid to be in structured English immersion or transitional bilingual, right? But we kind of see some of these things at the beginning, right? Like this, for example, at the very beginning, these kids in immersion have much higher NDW than these kids do. So that's just reality. It's just, I guess, or maybe the school district is deciding this kid is an English learner, but we think we can get him or her kind of, learning English faster than this other kid because this kid's a lot lower, right? So maybe that has something to do with it. Okay, so now I'm going to sort of switch gears and I'm going to move to the data we're collecting here in Dallas. So this is almost like a downward extension of everything you just saw. So this is looking at what happens before the kids get to kindergarten, right? So we know there's a lot of focus now on preschool and so on and so forth. So the questions are very similar, but everything is earlier in time, right? And how does that growth, the pre-kinder growth, relate to this growth after kinder, right? And the same thing, might we eventually find differences by preschool educational context? Whether that means the kids are going to preschool or whether that means the kids are not going to preschool, right? And what type of preschool are they attending? Right? So what we're doing now in the lab, we actually have 2 different projects that we're doing at the same time. They're both longitudinal. We're collecting data in the fall and spring. And we're usually about 4 different sites. So we started tracking preschoolers that are between the ages of 3 and 4. The vast majority come from low SES homes in Dallas. We're collecting their retail language samples. In one particular site, we're collaborating with Margaret Owen's lab, and they're collecting data on self-regulation skills. They've tried a couple of different tasks, but they've kind of have stuck with this head, toes, knees task, which essentially the kids have to do the opposite of what you tell them to do. So if you say touch your toes, they have to touch. See, I did it wrong. If I say touch your toes, you're supposed to touch your head. So you do the opposite.
I
Right?
hear themselves right now.
Yeah, I would be really bad. Anyway, it keeps getting more complex and so on and so forth. So that's, and the idea there is, and that would be another talk, but it's like, is there a relationship between dual language development and development of self-regulation skills in preschoolers who are Hispanic and Spanish speaking? We basically counterbalanced everything. And then we also collected home language surveys from the parents. And we do that every fall semester. So this is sort of like an overview of the two projects. This is one project, this is another project. This is a school in Oak Cliff. It's an English immersion laboratory preschool. It's approximately 92% Hispanic. 86% of the kids get free or reduced lunch. The kids in this particular program, they're not in preschool, but they are going to what's called a 2-generation program. So it's a program 1 day a week in which the parents get information and the kids essentially go through a school day in this curriculum. Right? And they go in when they're about, some of the kids actually go when they're really young, but usually 3 or 4. In this particular school, we're currently in our 3rd year of data collection, and I want to say we're in our 2nd year. This is the data that we've collected so far in terms of participants and language samples. And this is the ongoing data that we're collecting. So this particular year in both projects, we began collecting data on a new cohort. So what we'll eventually be able to do, we'll have to run certain diagnostics to make sure we can do this. But the idea is you're running 2 longitudinal projects, and then you're picking up new cohorts of kids that are young again, so you can eventually basically have a larger sample. Things that I'll talk about today. You saw these measures before. This is one that you haven't seen. This is essentially deciding whether an utterance is grammatical or not. And the decision that we use is if there's one or more grammatical error, it's an ungrammatical utterance. That's pretty simple. And then for the Momentous project, I'll show you some data on this. And the independent variable for now, I ran some preliminary data, just looking at growth. So they're kind of simple growth models without looking at other covariates. As before, we have the same challenge, right? These are all different kids. And as you can see, there's a lot of differences, right? Some kids have 3 time points, some kids have 2, some kids have 1, but essentially the part that I kind of want to highlight is the fact that every kid has a slightly different empirical growth clock. Right? This is all in English. This is what their trajectories look like for, this was in the first 2 years. So there's about 38, 39 kids, and these are the same kids, but in their Spanish from UW. So I'll show you, I'm going to show you some data. I'm not going to show you a ton, and that's because some of my doc students are working on this, so I don't want to do everything. I want them to be able to talk about stuff when they talk about stuff. So I'll show you data for a year and a half that we have. We have arguably 3 years of data, but we're not done with the 3rd year. But I'll show you kind of the halfway point, right? So this is basically 1.5 years in preschool. And this is for the Momentous school. So this is a school where the kids are getting English-only instruction. They get some support during preschool, but really the focus is English immersion. So what you see here across semesters is that their MOUW in English starts out a little higher. Now, whenever you compare English and Spanish, you want to be a little careful, right? So when we look at this initial time point, this to me doesn't mean that much, because in Spanish we're able to drop nouns and we're able to drop pronouns. So the fact that the utterances might be a little shorter in Spanish than they are in English is not hugely surprising to me. What I want to look at is the actual growth rate of each. Right? So these kids, these are all the same kids, but the kids in this English immersion school are showing obviously very aggressive growth in their utterance length in English. And in Spanish, it's not decaying, but it's not nearly as robust. Right? So this is a significant model, both in terms of intercept and slopes. If we look at a number of different words, you see something that's a little bit interesting. This is one of the few measures that's cross-linguistically somewhat comparable, because it's not dependent on the morphology of the language. It's just about really semantically, do you have different words that you're able to use expressively in your language, right? So what we see here is maybe a little bit more what you would expect at the beginning, the fact that these kids have slightly more words in Spanish than they do in English when they enter the school. So these are kids who are coming in, some of them at 3 years old, some of them at 4 years old, preschool. So they're there all day. What we see here is, this is huge, right? It's huge progress. This, it's not stagnant. There's a little bit of growth, but it's not even comparable, right? So basically, after the first semester, by the time they're in their second semester of preschool, there's already a massive gap between the vocabulary in English and in Spanish. Do you have a question? Oh. Now this is the one that is even kind of maybe more interesting. This is the proportion of utterances that are grammatical. So again, what you would expect, these are primarily Spanish-speaking kids who are learning English. They're starting out with near 80% grammaticality in Spanish, and about 62% grammaticality in English. Right? What you see is that basically by their third semester, there's been a shift in this. So this is actual negative growth of Spanish. So they're becoming more ungrammatical in a language that they used to be very grammatical in. Right?
Sorry. Are they using English grammar? Is that what the
Yeah.
answers are? So they're but I mean,
So this
in
is
Spanish.
No, this is grammaticality in English. So these are the same kids, and we have
So-
language samples in Spanish and language
Yeah.
samples in English.
No,
Yeah.
my question is their Spanish starting to take on the grammatical structure of English? Is that what's making it ungrammatical?
Maybe.
Okay.
Maybe. Stay tuned. That's something that you will stay tuned, because there are people who are working on this.
That's a good question.
Yeah, trying to figure out what are the errors that these kids are making,
You
right?
have to kill you then.
Yeah.
Okay.
I see. I get your question. Yeah.
Yeah.
The answer is perhaps, right?
Spanglish.
Yeah. And then this is the self-regulation measure. What we have found with this is that they start out, regardless of what you test them in, at a pretty similar level. And then they get better at self-regulation. Whether you test, and this is really more of a, if you thought about it language-wise, it's really a self-regulation test, but it's all really receptive. The kids are listening and they have to do stuff, right? But you even start to see a little bit of a separation, right? So it'll be interesting to see what happens to their receptive language in Spanish.
I'm curious with this task, what makes it get more complex? Like, how does it increase?
So I think at the beginning, and Svenja might be able to correct me if I'm wrong on this, because were you trained on it?
No.
Okay.
I think
So, well, Giselle might know, but I think, and I could be totally wrong, because I don't do this. I don't know if you were ever trained, but from what I sort of remember, and again, I could be totally wrong, is the first sort of version of this is you're only doing, for example, like heads and toes, right? That's all it is. You're just alternating, and then in a more complex phase, you start adding other body parts. So you end up adding body parts, and then some instructions are like do the opposite, and some instructions start to become do the same thing, and
So
maybe
they
do the opposite, and we do certain
So-
body parts, and do the same thing in specific body parts. So you have to remember what body parts are associated with doing the same thing versus the opposite thing. So I think this is how it gradually gets. So if a kid scores really well, then they go on to more complex one and more complex one.
So it's a self-regulation task that's very dependent on language. It's not a language.
Yeah, and that's why we're
That's
interested
what
in
we want.
seeing if does the language that you test the kid in make a difference.
And is then it correlates.
It's very dependent
right?
on
So,
receptive language.
I mean,
Yeah.
it seems like a kid who's doing poorly in language would do poorly with this. Because there are measures of self-regulation in non-language that you should have a big benefit, that you could have a
Yeah.
benefit in bilingualism that may not show up when it's this
Exactly.
language dependent.
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
so we've collected 2 years of data in both languages. Margaret Owen's lab, partly due to personnel issues and partly because of the data that we're seeing, is they've decided to, for this 30-year data collection, they're only testing the kids in English now. They're no longer doing it in Spanish because they weren't seeing much of a difference between Spanish and English. Well, that's true for year 1. I don't think we know about year 2 yet, but the decision was made due to a number of other reasons. So, okay, so what are implications of this? So if we look at these kids at the very beginning of the fall semester of preschool, I kind of basically talked about all this stuff already, but there are certain areas of their Spanish that are stronger in the beginning, some things in English, these things don't differ much. And then over the course of 1.5 years, we see that NDW in English essentially overtakes NDW in Spanish. We're seeing a reversal here, right? An acceleration of English grammaticality, a deceleration of Spanish grammaticality. And that happens by the beginning of the second year, and then this starts growing negatively by actually year 1, by the second semester of the first year. And then these things are growing in both languages, but they're heads and toes skills, they're accelerating a little faster in English. So diving deeper into this is something that I'll start talking about a little bit, but I won't talk too much about it. So this is something that Svenja is starting to work on, which is looking at, after consultation with the committee, she wanted to do too much, and I agree. So she's looking at only the English, essentially the emerging grammatical development, I would say in a very large sense, of these kids in this particular English immersion school. And so this was one project that we did last year. And Svenja's doing some other stuff now that I'll briefly talk about. But this is a project we did last year. So we decided to look over the course of one preschool year, how does grammaticality in English change? And what seems to be driving that? And for that, we started looking at error types, which you started asking about, right? So is it potentially errors with the verb or the tense marking system in English, or is it other kinds of errors, right? Because we know that Spanish-speaking kids master their verb system a lot earlier than English-speaking kids when they're monolingual, right? But when you have a kid who's learning English second language, are they going to have a hard time with tense marking, or is it going to be really easy for them? Right? So this is summarizing the findings. This is the first thing. How does the grammaticality change over time? And you want to look at this particular sort of trajectory here. So this is looking at the proportion of how ungrammatical they are. Right? So in their first semester of preschool, they're about 45%, they're specifically 43% of their utterances are ungrammatical. And then by their second semester, that drops to 32%. Right? That still means that 1 out of every 3 utterances is ungrammatical in English. Right? They're getting better. And so what we saw here is we saw a moderate effect size of this change. And the other question was, what seems to be accounting for these changes or driving these changes? And then if you look at these two, these are the proportion of errors that are not tense marking errors, but that are morphosyntactic. And then this is the proportion of tense marking errors. So from the very beginning, they have a huge difference in terms of the error types that they're making. And it seems that the tense marking system is something that's really challenging for these kids. Right? And in this particular set of data, they actually, that proportion increases as they start learning more English. Right? So they're having to sort out the tense marking system in English. And both of these differences had large effect sizes. So future steps. So Svenja, she's a second-year PhD student. She's essentially diving into this piece, right? Looking at this emergence of finite verb morphology in the English of bilingual kids. And so, she will eventually talk about this, but she's sort of looking at something like the finite word morphology composite and developing adaptive versions of this that might allow irregular verb tense marking in terms of the emergence of it. Right? So when we see kids that say things like, I go to the store, they're marking the past tense on irregular, right? So they're kind of doing this kind of sort of over-regularization thing, right? And we see that with the kids that we have. And then Lindsay, who's a first-year PhD student, is starting to develop her qualifying thesis. But she's really starting to focus on this notion of first language loss, which not a lot of people have researched. It's a huge need that we have in the field. And that's kind of looking at some of these things you were saying, like what sorts of errors are making, but from the perspective of that Spanish regression, that sort of loss of skills that they previously had that they're starting to be able to do. And obviously, what impact might that have on the English? Okay, man, I'm not even near done. That's almost one. I'm just gonna skip to the end. Yeah, I didn't think I was gonna have enough, but all right. Okay, yeah, I'll show you 2 more slides. So other related things, these are some kind of findings from last year from some related projects. This one was kind of neat. We wanted to do this for a while. We looked at several hundred kids who retold different stories of like these frog stories that everybody knows. And the idea was like, are there differences based on the actual story, right? And so we kind of did a systematic breakdown of the stories and like, okay, how many episodes are there? How many characters? How many sort of situations? And does that seem to have an impact on language measures? And the answer is, overwhelmingly, the answer to that is no. Meaning that it's a really stable way to look at language sampling in a very structured way. This was a study with one of Dr. Owen's doctoral students, and hopefully we'll soon be publishing the dissertation piece of this. But the idea here is to try to look at the relationship between vocabulary development and inhibitory control in Spanish-speaking kids. And in this particular data set, which is not mine, we found that kids that had higher degrees of vocabulary attainment between this time period tended to predict higher inhibitory control in kids who were Spanish-speaking. And then this last study, it has to do with, one of the things that I had sort of noted is that we're collecting home language surveys on these families. This kind of relates to that in the sense that this was a study in kindergarten only to try to determine if kids are using languages with different people in their environment, right? What sorts of impacts does that have, right? So speaking to different people, are you doing it in different ways? Is that having some sort of impact, right? And one of the things that was really interesting is language use at home with parents, with mom, with dad, the languages that mom and dad use with you, and the languages that you use with mom and dad, by the beginning of kindergarten seem to kind of really diminish for these kids. And what really starts to matter for their English development is their language use with their peers in school and with their older siblings. Right? And also at the maternal education level. So even if the mom has a high maternal education in Spanish, that will also lead to higher acquisition of English language skills. And in Spanish, it's a lot more restricted. So almost everything that we looked at was meaningless by kindergarten. But the only thing that seemed to matter was if they still had interactions with older siblings for Spanish. And I'll just end with this, some future steps, just all kinds of little things that we can try to do later on. And that's like a year and a half ago. And that's our mascot for the lab. So lots of those people are still here, some of them have graduated, but thank you. And thanks for staying.